Thank you so much for joining us at Alabama Policy Insights. Today we have the Alabama Attorney General, Steve Marshall, here with us. Thanks for being here, Steve.
Oh, good to be with you.
So we wanted to have you in for a couple of reasons. One is to talk about your path to public service and just kind of what being a district attorney and attorney general has meant to you professionally. So if you would just start by just kind of walk us through your path to public service and why you chose the route that you chose.
Yeah, I mean, this was not expected. Never viewed myself or had this vision of sort of eventually my sort of profession being in the world of public service. And it's a strange story for me is that I was went to big law for the beginning of my career, 5 years, worked with great people, but wanted to live more in a rural setting. Felt like a little bit of that was at least where my passion was in the practice. And strangely enough, being up in Guntersville, got appointed to represent a guy in a criminal case. And very long story short, he was a two-time convicted felon charged with attempted murder, shot a guy in the back because he lost playing checkers. That's what you do, right? You shoot a guy in a .22 as he was walking down the hill away from him. And, I'm not the smartest guy, but there's not a lot of defense to that. He wasn't at risk. There wasn't a threat. And so the guy's name was James Arthur Williams, spoke with James Arthur a lot. There was an offer to settle his case for less than life without the possibility of parole, which would have been his sentence. James Arthur didn't want to do it. I tried to get him to talk to the judge, to another person that was close to the parole office, didn't want to do it. We tried the case. Facts lay out exactly like I told you. The guy went over to his house. They were drinking, playing checkers. James Arthur had to pay him some money. Guy gets shot in the back, fortunately lived. We put James Arthur up and testified and had closing arguments, and the jury came back and did what we would all expect. They found him not guilty.
Wow.
And I remember James Arthur shaking my hand, walking out the door, and I sat there in that courtroom and thought, this is not where I want to be.
Yeah.
And to the extent that God had blessed me with any skills and talents, to me, it wasn't on that side of the house. And it really sort of sparked a little bit of the fire for me about being a prosecutor. And, you don't necessarily open up a practice to be a prosecutor. That's actually got to be in the government service side. And it was just random how that became an opportunity for me in Marshall County back in 2001. And it was really where passion and purpose met for me. And it's weird that at that point I'm 30 plus years old, never really, when I went to law school, I never saw myself as a criminal lawyer. Never thought that would be what would
Not the
be,
chosen path.
No, at all. And yet I can tell you individual stories of where you're able to make life change and a difference that was remarkably rewarding. I mean, it's a challenging job. I was blessed to work around some really great people, but it's still, it's hard work, and it's not something that you don't take home. And when you're exposed to the worst of the worst crimes and, been in crime scenes, seeing people for the first time and they're laying dead in front of me, or a 1 year old in a day, Uriel Hernandez that I met that had 3 fractured ribs, 20 plus bruises across his body, human bite marks, and died from abusive head trauma, or the child pornography that you have to see in order to do the job to hold offenders accountable.
Yeah.
But it was one that when you're able to be the voice for that victim, when you have a chance to work with the people that are my heroes, which are the law enforcement officers across our state, it was just an amazing opportunity, and really never saw myself doing anything more. The intrigue for me about AG was just that seemed to be something you could do at a wider level. That is a local prosecutor, you definitely sort of work at kind of the micro side of the house. And this was a way to be able to influence policy at a broader level. And, sort of in full transparency, when I walked into the AG's job, I kind of saw it as a super DA, not like super DA.
Well, that was your experience.
You could go all over the state. You had the chance to work with law enforcement throughout Alabama, and that was the pull. But now, having been in this job 8 years, it is unbelievable the opportunities that are available to an attorney general, not just in Alabama, but across the country,
Right.
to not just be that sort of chief law enforcement officer, which is still the role that
Right.
I sort of view myself as mostly, but the ability to engage at a national level and impact what's going on in our country, and particularly the last 4 years.
Right.
We can talk a little bit about that. Is
Sure.
you really are the finger in the dike, because you're the only game in town when you have a divided Congress that otherwise isn't willing to rein in an unbridled administration. But I think the growth aspect for me in this role has been to see, where do you leverage those levers of power and authority that are wholly outside of the criminal justice realm. It doesn't mean that you diminish what you do on the criminal justice side, and we have a remarkable team that does that. But look, the nuts and bolts of prosecution are done at the local level with local DA's offices. We have some role in that, but it's not as big as what's going on there. But what we can leverage in a way that is, I think, sort of allowing Alabama to outkick its coverage in some respects with our size, is the ability to chase issues across our country that maybe other people are unwilling or don't have the courage to do.
Right. Yeah. And I definitely think as Attorney General, you almost immediately stepped into that role. I mean, I think it was heightened during those Biden years, but almost immediately stepped into that role. Tell me a little bit about your relationship with other AGs from other states and how those relationships impacted you and the decisions that you made on what to engage with, or vice versa.
Yeah, terrific friends across the country. I mean, it's neat that the current United States Attorney General is a dear friend, and you're texting, right? I mean, it's just, those used to be people that you looked up to and like, oh, they're just these far across, not your personal friends. And so, it's very neat, even within this administration, to have those contacts with folks that are big decision makers. But, was blessed early on to work with some colleagues that kind of took an opportunity to sort of help give me the lay of the land and understand what it is that we could do in Alabama. And then, so relationships there, but also, I was blessed to be able to bring in staff early on that likewise understood what that was like. Catherine Robertson, who is obviously a critically important part of our team, who had very much a national feel from the work that she had done with this organization as well as with the Department of Justice. Andrew Brasher, who was my first Solicitor General, was one that had terrific influence on me. Corey Mays, who is now one of our district judges in Anniston, phenomenal intellect, helped us kind of lead the charge in multiple efforts. And so I think it's both what we had internally and externally really helped to be able to guide it. But we've charted our own path in Alabama. It's funny, some of the early immigration fights, there was probably only 7 or 8 of us that were willing to be able to stand up on that. But maybe one of the victories that people don't talk about the most that we had, where we really were kind of the sole actor for a long time, was the pushback against the ERA.
Right.
And I think especially what this organization has done to help us push back on the radical gender ideology that came out of the Biden administration. If, in fact, that 1972 amendment that referenced equality of sex, where even the proponents on the left, the Ruth Bader Ginsburgs, would have told you she knew what a woman was, right?
Exactly.
I mean, that wouldn't have been a problem.
Not a question.
If you'd have put that in the hands of the current left, if they had a constitutional amendment that talked about equality of sexes, they would have broadened that definition to include the transgender movement, and we would have had a much more difficult time in defending laws like we have in Alabama that keep children from being the victims of child abuse and mutilation.
Right.
And so we were the state that said, when Virginia tried to say we're the 38th state, this is now a part of the Constitution, we're the ones that sued to be able to get the agreement from the archivist, which I don't think many people even knew that position existed. I didn't, candidly. And it's why when a actively senile Joe Biden sends out a press release and a tweet that tries to say it's suddenly a part of the Constitution, while we had the legal victories to be able to say that it wasn't. And so what I think being the AG in Alabama gives you the opportunity to do is to be able to say, in a conservative state we have the chance to be able to pull other states along with us in these national fights. And, it's real easy, for example, for 28 AGs to come together and say that we're going to support President Trump in the removal of violent gang members under the Alien Enemies Act to be able to take them away from foreign soil. But there are other issues where it's not always so easy. And it's
hard to
the
be
ability.
first.
Yeah. I mean, look, the stuff that we did in defending VCAP.
Yes.
We were the third state in the country to be able to do
Yeah,
it.
second or third. I think Arkansas was ahead.
And, we end up investing the resources and the time and the energy to be able to develop not only the legal theory to be able to defend it, but just the factual underpinning of a medical and legal fraud that is maybe not ever been seen in our country. And so it's why I think I have a unique privilege that the people of Alabama give me to allow us to be able to be forward-leaning and aggressive on issues that maybe others aren't, and then to be able to develop not only the policy arguments and the legal arguments to support it that give other states the courage to do what we've done.
Yeah, it's a leadership role that's ready-made. Not all attorney generals have stepped into that role.
Right.
I will say.
Right.
I won't call names, but yeah, there are not all Alabama attorney generals have stepped into that role. You mentioned the VCAP legislation, and then the legal fight after that. At the time, that was before I was at API, but I was involved. And at the time, in the legislative discussion, much of the discussion was this is not a problem. This is not something that's occurring. You're trying to create a solution for a problem that doesn't exist, et cetera, and think about how much water is under the bridge on that specific issue just, in the last several years. So being on the forefront of issues is really a difficult thing to do. And so that's one of the reasons I wanted to have you in and talk about that.
And it's one reason why API I think is so critically important, because you're exposing things that in a ruby red state aren't consistent. I mean, who knew that UAB had a clinic that was engaging in so-called gender-affirming care that really I don't think many people knew about. And it's why, look, we saw the exposed recently about the UAB grant.
Yes.
And I still have trouble saying this, by the way. They're going to study transgender male vaginal health.
Yes.
I mean,
it seems like an oxymoron.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sure.
Right here in Alabama, and the work done around VCAP. And look, it was an interesting debate at the time, and one that I think we can appreciate. It was this idea of a parent's right to help dictate medical choices with regard to the care of their kids. Right. And I respect that completely. Yes. But yet, what we have learned is the fact that sort of gender dysphoria, which is legitimate and real, the fact that parents were never given full information, number one, about the impact of engaging in a young girl putting a testosterone shot in her thigh once a week to be able to change the gender, not talking about what the potential consequences of those are, but then also not being truthful and candid about the range of treatment that was available. It was almost, and look, I do think there's a money.
It's an informed consent issue.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
This was a money grab. I'm fully convinced of that.
I agree.
And you can look around the country about where that's going on. If you're giving a kid counseling, it's sure not as profitable as selling them drugs, otherwise engaging in medical procedures.
And perpetual patients.
Absolutely. And yet what we were able to do in pulling back that veil is to demonstrate that this wasn't anything to do with parents' rights.
Right.
This was a political agenda that was being driven by those who wanted to push the movement. One of the things that, for example, that we exposed in the discovery in the criminal trial, it should be a criminal trial, in that civil trial was Rachel Levine, which most folks that listen to this podcast are going to be fully aware of. Sure. A male pediatrician who loved being a father, talked about what it meant to be a parent, then transitions over and wants to take that away from these kids that he wants to be able to provide these drugs to. But what was interesting is what we exposed in that is that W. Path, who was leading this charge, was at least going to place age restrictions on when kids could have surgeries. Now, again, should never have surgery to begin with. But at least they were providing something.
Yes.
And you get Rachel Levine, who's second in charge at Health and Human Services, saying, don't do this. Take away those restrictions because you're inhibiting our ability to push the transgender political movement.
Right.
Not what's good for kids, not what's appropriate for their care, but let's talk about what you're doing from a standard of care that impacts our political agenda.
And the political optics of it.
And again, that's the discrete issue of VCAP and what was going on there. But we saw an administration that was willing to use this whole of government approach to deal with all of the issues that they couldn't get past politically, but was trying to use the hammer of federal spending to be able to get their agenda in red states, blue states, and across the country.
Yeah, another issue, that's kind of parallel to that issue, at least to me, is the girls in sports issue. And, Alabama.
Again, another, by the way, solution without a problem.
Yes.
Until we begin to see the stories of where that is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, even recently, we were working on the male and female definitions bill with Representative Susan DuBose and April Weaver, which passed and has already been signed, which is fantastic. But having to have the discussion about definitions and having to have the discussion about protecting women's spaces and protecting girls in sports. When we first started that discussion, there were threats that the NCAA would, leave the state and, all kinds of things that never came to fruition. But that's another one of those areas that you stepped into. And that's another one of those areas where Alabama ended up leading by pushing forward those Alabama values.
Yeah, it was neat to be getting the invitation. This has been about a month ago now to go to the White House and talk about what Alabama's done.
Right.
And what was really refreshing is we were at the White House with several states. We had General Bondi was there. Administration officials were there. This was right after the signing of the EO, which I think was a critically important just statement of where we are in the
setting
country,
the tone.
Right. Same thing with Susan's bill, and grateful for y'all's leadership there. But we heard the testimony of 5 young athletes. One, the young volleyball player from Murphy, North Carolina, that was at the State of the Union, had trauma as a result of that. But what was equally compelling were the 2 track athletes from Maine. We've seen that story. And by the way, I think everybody's probably seen the interchange between President Trump and the Maine governor, right?
Right.
But to hear them speak from the heart about, and there was no, look, to them, there was no physical harm.
Right.
But when they talked about the countless hours they had spent training, what it is they had put into their sport and how important it was to them, and the fact that one was a pole vaulter that was deprived of the podium because of this male athlete competing as a girl, and then the other young lady whose team didn't win the state championship, and talked about how important it was to her as a senior that this was part of what they'd done. And what was refreshing about that, and particularly as somebody that sits in my role, this equated the fight that we were engaged with a personal story.
Right.
It's a little bit of that old prosecutor in me. And prosecutors are just simply storytellers. I mean, you're sharing what took place as a way of convincing a jury with facts and law as to why that individual is guilty. But for me, in hearing the passionate tales of those young ladies, it was like, these fights are worth the fight.
Absolutely.
And one of the reasons why passing the law was so important in Alabama is that when you have a Department of Agriculture that wanted to impact the free lunch program for low-income kids to make us change the definition of sex to gender identity, when you had workplace regulations that were coming where you're going to have to use preferred pronouns or you're going to get sued. You got to allow bathrooms to open up or you're going to get sued. When you see the work that we've done around Title IX, which likewise was going to change that, to declare that as the official public policy of Alabama is more than just simply a statement of principle.
Right.
It is also something that we can leverage if, in fact, we were having to defend those fights in the future. And so I think a critically important step, and one that I think very much in tune with the people of Alabama. And I don't think this is a left-right issue. I mean, this is a fundamental fairness
issue. It's a bipartisan issue, no question.
And it's why it's so strange to see the Democrats fight it. Because I really think it's an 80-20 kind of question.
Right.
And look, I think you may have been at one of our town halls where not everybody in there agreed with me and Susan and others that were there.
Right.
but it was very much the majority of individuals. And there is inherently this idea, around this issue. And then, even the immigration question I was talking earlier about, Trans de Agua, about removing them.
Yes.
Majority of folks do not want them in our communities, and wholeheartedly embrace this idea of removing those individuals there. And it's why it's astonishing some of the fights that the Dems are willing to fight right now, because it's not a left, right. And even I'll tell you just sort of strange story about the VCAP fight is we had this weird coalition that I didn't even know was coming. And that is of conservatives and of the gay and lesbian community.
Right.
And I'll give you an example of where that came about. In preparing for our initial hearing on the VCAP challenge, we had conversations with a young man out of the state of New York. And he talked about, as a kind of 12, 13-year-old, he was attracted to things that made him think, I'm not a boy, I'm really a girl.
Right.
And so he went through all that gender affirming care, became and identified himself as a female. And then when he gets to being sort of 19 and 20 years old, realizes, I'm not a girl.
Right.
I'm just a gay man.
Okay. Yeah.
And as a result of all that's been done, now my life is totally upside down. And what you hear the gay and lesbian community talk about is this is transing gay kids. And so while we come at it from different perspectives,
End up in the same spot.
they are, yes, with the same result wanted, which is
Right.
we got to stop doing this to our kids.
Right.
And so it's very interesting to me on issues where, apparently this was such an important question for the left that you have our most recent addition to the United States Supreme Court at a confirmation hearing, unwilling to state publicly what a woman is,
Right.
to now I think that pendulum coming back toward this direction. And it's
I
why
agree.
a little bit of a broader sort of question to me in all the issues that we can kind of talk about is I think we're reclaiming culture.
I agree.
And that is the driver of what I think politics follows. And you and I kind of share an interest in people that write around this area, that truly when we're engaging in those fights, and I get tickled at sometimes, Steve Marshall's a culture warrior. Well, by golly, yeah. I'll accept that.
Right.
And if I'm standing on those things of faith and family that matter and communities, give me that title and I'll continue to raise that sword. But part of the reason you do that is you don't want to relinquish the principle that ultimately matters to you the most. And if we can stay true to the core principles, then we can develop policy that advances those that matter to communities and keep, I think, communities safe, healthy, and vibrant.
Absolutely. One of the things that you engaged on recently had to do, shifting gears a little bit, had to do with COVID and accountability for Anthony Fauci. Can you speak a few minutes about how you're engaging in that area?
Yeah, the last part I'll speak to and can only do briefly, in that we join with multiple AGs to ask Congress to send us information relating to their investigation, not only to Dr. Fauci, but what was surrounding the standards and protocols and policies that came out of D.C. during that period.
Yes.
I talked earlier about what we exposed on the VCAP side was just this underbelly of a conspiracy between activist groups, between activist lawyers and government officials propounding a fraud on the American people. Well, I won't be surprised if we don't see something similar. Now, there's a team going to be able to look at those records when they're ultimately obtained. I think Congress will cooperate with us. Uniquely, every state has its own laws that may or may not apply in that area. And we're going to actively look to see what we see that may have been impacted here in our state. At a minimum, we'll help support the efforts of those who want to be able to review it. But, look, COVID, and I said this in a speech, and some people kind of thought this was strange recently. COVID, a tragic situation in our country, right? Loss of life impacted families. But we also have seen some good emerge from it as well. Because, look, but for COVID, would we understand the indoctrination of kids that was going on around multiple issues? Would we have had any understanding of how far government would go to impact personal liberty of individuals? Would we have known how far the government was going to go to open up bathrooms and girls' sports and locker rooms, right? And in some ways, would we have be as aware now
Mm-hmm.
if that had not come to light? I mean, would you have ever been worried about what your kid was going to see at a library? I mean, I don't think that was
I spent most of my childhood in the library.
Yeah. Would,
Yeah.
would as a parent, we be concerned about allowing a
Mhm.
kid to be unfettered and unsupervised there? No, it's a safe place, right?
Right.
And so to some extent, the work around COVID, I think, has made conservatives better prepared, more energized, and also more strategic in sort of understanding that what the left did, to their credit, is gain access to institutional power in places outside of government that have then been able to use the authority and levers in those areas. Let's take higher education as an example. For one of them, I mean, would we have at all expected post October 7th to see what was going on in college campuses and what was being advanced there? And so part of me, at least, as I think about the work that we did, it was a difficult time.
Yes.
Because, I mean, look, we were all struggling trying to figure out where's the role and what's the role of government. But, we had active litigation on the compelled vaccines.
Yes.
Had tremendous success on the federal contractor side, on the workplace safety.
Mm-hmm.
But what's interesting to me is we were not successful on healthcare workers. And what's funny, this is a little wonky on the legal side, but you had two corresponding cases at the Supreme Court.
Mm-hmm.
One that did not involve the healthcare workers, that involved business and industry, where they fully supported our position, which you can't compel and can't use the workplace safety authority given through OSHA as a way of dealing with a public health crisis, which is historically a state issue and not a federal issue.
Right.
And when we had sort of states coming together, industry groups coming together, we convinced the court 6-3 to strike that down. But yet on the public health side of the house, it was crickets. And what we saw, and although it's referenced
because they didn't stand up for themselves.
They didn't stand up for themselves,
yes.
Or more importantly, the people that delivered the services on a day-to-day basis. That 6-3 win became a 5-4 loss, where Kavanaugh and Chief Justice Roberts went to the other side, and they specifically referenced, we don't hear the healthcare community coming out against this. And so it's why, going back to kind of the initial thing I talked about, why the Fauci-led effort is so critical to understand how it happened.
Sure.
Because while public health is in that domain that, kind of and still are, right, in some respects,
Absolutely.
leveraging that invasion into personal liberty, we need to understand a little bit more why. But the other thing around, a little bit separate from COVID, and sometimes people say, well, why is Steve Marshall using Alabama resources on cases that occur outside of our state? Well, I think right now people pretty appreciative of Coach Kennedy.
Right.
The fact that not only did we support a man who principally said, I want to voluntarily pray in the middle of a football field after a game and support my religious expression rights, but with that, we also changed establishment clause case law moving forward that helps everybody in the country. But, we recently supported an Amish school in the state of New York who said, we're not going to comply with a compelled vaccine regimen because it is against our religious beliefs. And, religious exemption and medical exemptions have historically been appropriately recognized in courts, but yet the state of New York wanted to pick on this small Amish school to be able to require them to do something that was absolutely against the tenets of their faith. And that's why I think it's important for us, despite the fact that what's going on in that community, it is all connected, in that when religious liberty interests are attacked, they're attacked for everyone. Because if they can leverage government control there, where are they going to make it appear in another place? And so, one of the more sort of interesting ones recently, we supported a Jewish synagogue in Tampa who wanted to have an event called Hanukkah on Ice. Now, I want to see what that looks like, right? But because it just sounds interesting. Yeah, for sure. But the reason why we got engaged is because the city wanted to not allow them to advertise on their transit system because they felt like it was an inappropriate message to be able to deliver to others that were riding the buses. And I'm like, no, we're not going to allow government to intervene in that way. And what was clearly an appropriate thing for them
Right.
to be able to advertise. And so, I'm not going to back away. It's not majority of what we do, but yet if I can support Jack Phillips in Colorado, Barronelle Stutzman in the state of Washington, if I can support the homeless mission in Seattle that wants to be able to live true to the commitment of their own faiths, then I think it's important for Alabama's voice to be heard,
I
because
agree.
while I'm not as worried about what our legislature could do to try to impact that, I am worried that it could potentially impact the case law that allows that to be a little bit easier. And to the extent that, as I think, that conservative state that can be the beacon for others around, to say that we can live in a principled way that's consistent with conservative values, and this is how we enrich our culture and our society, being engaged in those fights, I think, is critically important.
Right. Yeah. And it was kind of snidely said after Trump took office that it was the Alabamification of the nation. And
Amen.
I thought that was a compliment.
It absolutely is a compliment. I mean, when we see the movement of the administration toward things that you and others have been fighting for
Right.
quite some time, then that's a validation. And not that anybody needed to pat you on the back.
Right.
But it is, I think, in a legislature that doesn't all the time act like that we're a supermajority, right? And you've
Agree.
written a lot about that, and
Yes.
appropriately so. It's a testament to be able to look at the folks in Montgomery and say, lead.
Right.
This is your chance to be able to lead and to be able to do it in a way that others can watch and be able to follow. Because despite our size, we have the ability to have a tremendous
Huge impact.
influence on what's going on around our country. And look, is Tish James in New York or Rob Bonta in California going to really care about what we do in Alabama? Well, I don't know, but I know that the AG in Michigan thought it was important to take a shot at me personally over the fact that I wasn't doing something that she was, which, number one, tells me I'm in the right spot. But also, if they want to target Alabama and not one of the bigger states, then maybe they're a little bit worried about us.
Right.
And I'm
if
okay
we're
with
the
that.
point of comparison,
Yeah,
then
I'm
that
okay
probably
with that.
means we're over the target.
I'm okay with that.
Yeah. And you mentioned the Trump administration saying and doing some things that API has advocated for since way before I was here at API, and that I think that's true. One of those areas is Doge. We created Al Doge last December, almost immediately after the election. It was clear to me the direction, from being involved with some policy type things before the election. I knew the direction that they were headed, and I thought, who in Alabama is going to Doge? And it occurred to me that API really has been Alabama's Doge for years already, and that what we really need to do is step into that role and get public input and really push toward the very same values that now the Trump administration was pushing on that, and Elon Musk specifically. And you've engaged in that issue as well on the federal side, on whether there have been some questions about having an outside type of individual engage in those types of activities with the bureaucracy, and also some, I think, fundamental questions about the executive branch and the ability for the executive branch to actually manage his or her own bureaucracy. And so if you wouldn't mind speaking for a few minutes about that.
If the Article 2 powers give the president the ability to lead the executive branch of government, how can you do it without knowing where the purse strings are? And particularly when they're not dedicated funding that Congress has mandated, but as opposed to other discretionary aspects of what a deep state bureaucracy is attempting to impose, then what oversight does the leader of the executive branch have if they can't get into the dollars and cents? And particularly in the funding environment in which we have in D.C., which is apparently printing money without any consequence.
Exactly.
I mean, look, it's the remarkable blessing of a balanced budget requirement in Alabama, right?
We would be in a world of
hurt.
I mean,
it's hugely important. And so, and by the way, if you predicted Elon Musk and Donald Trump, more power to you.
I did not predict that, but I did meet with Vivek Ramaswamy, and he gave me a little bit of insight into where they were headed.
It is amazing what that's done. And look, I think it raises for everybody in Congress this idea of how well were we doing congressional oversight, which is part of their responsibility, which is another story.
Absolutely.
And it just shows you how the ability of the deep state to be able to hide what it is they're doing and how it is they're doing it. It's interesting. One of the things that API wrote about years ago that I think is important to continue to remember is federal spending power is a remarkable tool to impose an agenda on states in areas where they're not allowed to do it. William Buckley's brother wrote a great book where he said that allowing federal money in basically an unfettered way lets the federal government dabble in areas that the Constitution doesn't allow. And so it's why it's a critically important point for DOJ not only to deal with waste, fraud, and abuse. I mean, when the Biden administration says we know there's probably over $560 billion of waste, fraud, and abuse that's out there. I mean, that's unfathomable, right? Yes. And especially if you acknowledge it and don't say what you're doing about it,
right?
Which is scary. Yeah, and the fact that it's being found and identified now, and not only just the abuse, but also where additional dollars are going. I mean, to foster and promote DEI.
The tentacles.
Where the agenda of the administration was being used through grant programs and other things to get out into the respective states, to impose that requirement just to be able to get the money. And I think from an Alabama's perspective, it's the question of, are we using our dollars efficiently and appropriately, and to be able to have that oversight. But one of the things we talked earlier about AGs getting a chance to defend, I mean, we're already involved in a couple of challenges by the Democratic AGs. I mean, they are eminently afraid of Elon Musk. Yeah. I mean, and what's also funny to me, I'm sorry, this is so random.
No, that's funny.
Our Green New Deal folks that want to be able to impose all these EV mandates, and now we're destroying Teslas, or we're trading in our Tesla to buy the Tahoe, right? I mean, it's like, come on, let's be consistent here.
Right.
Let's buy a Rivian at least, as opposed to a Tesla. But let's don't it all be principally consistent. But what?
Those political symbols are really interesting to watch shift back and forth.
DC doesn't like agitation, and they don't like transparency, and they don't like what can be exposed. I mean, look, mainstream media is not going to expose it, right? We know that. We've already seen. They wouldn't expose a president who lost the faculties to be able to govern this country. And suddenly the auto pen becomes important for them to write about now, when apparently it wasn't before. But on DOJ, we are defending the Democratic AGs coming after just their ability to access data. I mean, these are government employees. What's there to hide? And it's not releasing data that invades individual privacy interests of American citizens. And then second, the fact that the DOJ was challenged over the federal buyouts. And
which was a gift.
Yes.
I mean, buyouts.
And you got the labor unions.
Just pink slips.
Yeah, the labor unions wanting to oppose the choice of employees to be able to voluntarily reduce themselves from the federal workforce. And so, feel good about where that's going. But the one thing, and I'll take this a little bit broader, you obviously have seen multiple lawsuits filed across the country by both Democratic AGs as well as private groups to be able to thwart the agenda of this administration. And, I hear discussions about, impeaching judges and what have you. I think the broader issue and the way to really resolve this is we can't allow an Article II judge that sits in Vermont, New Hampshire, Oregon, to, through a stroke of a pen, stop the federal government from implementing policy. They talk about it, nationwide injunctions. That's not the way we should be designed.
It's not the system that
you take, for example,
the
fight that we had around Title IX, that regulation. It was Alabama leading 4 states, filed in Birmingham. The relief that we asked for was to exempt those 4 states from the implementation of the act. It was limited to the parties before the court. It wasn't one that it was this blanket injunction across the country. The Democrats used that, to their credit, effectively during the first Trump administration, particularly some of the immigration efforts. And now they're attempting to replicate that same thing. Either Congress, or I think even, we already have Justice Gorsuch, Justice Thomas have written about this extensively. I think Justice Alito would be there with them. If we can tee up the right case to put before the court, they can make it abundantly clear that the ability of a court to enjoin the federal government is limited to the parties that are there before them.
Okay.
And
that makes sense.
so that we restrain the unlawful exercise of authority of that district judge in a way that confounds the ability of the executive branch to do their work. Doesn't say they don't have the ability to issue an order that can be challenged as these things are going on.
That can be broadened, but it narrows the scope from the
just
beginning.
Absolutely narrows the scope of what they're going to do to what I think is the appropriate way. And look, I'll tell you, in the role that I'm in as AG, when we had the Biden administration come in, I mean, we were actively engaged in suing the Biden administration. I mean, countless, over 200 lawsuits.
I was
going to
say, have you kept count? Because I've lost count.
But, it was like this idea, well, do you try to use the tool that the Democrats had because nobody said you can't? Principally, I think there was this idea that, we came from a position that we don't think it's appropriate,
right?
But yet the courts weren't willing to disallow it. But we attempted to be targeted in the effort of what we were doing, and so I think if we can get that relief, which I think I think that's what should be where courts land, then it inhibits the ability for the left to have such a stranglehold on the policy initiatives of this administration.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's really interesting. One state-specific, a couple of state-specific things I wanted to ask you about. One is the Ten Commandments and the public display of the Ten Commandments. That's, as you well know, been a controversial thing within the state and nationwide. And if you would just speak about, just from a historical perspective, more than an active political perspective, your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it sits in the United States Supreme Court. Sits in the Capitol building. It is fundamentally a basis on which our country was founded on those principles. And sure, did Moses describe this in detail coming from what God inscribed on that tablet? Absolutely. But it's also, it has absolute impact on our system of laws, our system of justice, and is historical significance in our country. And by the way, tell me the harm of children reading and following the principles that are contained within those Ten Commandments. And so, we have a constitutional amendment in Alabama that was passed several years ago that fundamentally states what the public policy of our state is, the importance of the Ten Commandments to our state as a whole, and passed overwhelmingly. What we've seen recently, and I give Jeff Landry, who was my former colleague as AG, now governor, one of the first things he's done is to be able to make it abundantly clear that if you're going to get education dollars in the state of Louisiana, we're going to display in classrooms with historical context, the Ten Commandments themselves. And so we led a brief supporting the challenge to Louisiana's law. I think that we will prevail. I say Louisiana will, with our help, be able to prevail in the Fifth Circuit on that particular question. And I would fundamentally love to be able to see Alabama adopt something similar.
I agree. And then two other issues that leap to mind that you've been active in several different layers has been the ongoing discussion about gambling in the state of Alabama, enforcement of that, and of the illegal activity that is going on. Sometimes those headlines, we're so used to that illegal activity. As a layperson, we're so used to that illegal activity. When there's a civil action or even a criminal action in that area, I think that people are just like, yeah, that's another one of those, and then it just kind of it kind of passes by. So, if you wouldn't mind speaking to some of your office's work in that area.
Yeah, it's almost been since day one, in the initiation of actions against Victoryland and Green Track. But this gets back to law enforcement doing their job. Law's clear in our state, and despite the efforts to cloud it by calling something electronic bingo, use them in slot machines.
Right.
And that's what they are.
It's a renaming.
It is, yeah. I mean, it's just like a rebranding,
right?
In some respects, and trying to confuse issues that aren't confusable, if that's the right word. But let's take Jefferson County, for example. When Mike Hale was sheriff, we didn't have a problem.
Right.
When we have law enforcement come in and go, well, we don't think we're going to enforce the laws in this area. We're going to do something else. What happens? The bad guys take advantage of it.
Sure.
And what I think bothers me from a bigger picture more is, where are these things popping up? It's not affluent communities. It's not in, retail areas in which the economy is thriving. It's in the poorest of the poor areas of our state. And you got to ask the question, why?
Right.
And it is absolutely targeting
People
our
who
most
are
vulnerable with people that don't have the money to be able to do it.
Right.
And it's clearly illegal, number one, but also it ought to bother folks as to how this is being laid out. And so, it shouldn't be the responsibility of the AG's office to come in and clean up what somebody else isn't doing, but we've had to do it. I mean, you've seen it in multiple cases, both big and small.
Yes.
But, so give you a sense of how brazen and organized they are. We shut down within the last year facilities over and around Demopolis. We used a vehicle in the civil law, not the criminal law, where we enjoined them. We shuttered the business while the case was pending, padlock on the door. We marked all the machines as contraband. And then literally within 2 weeks, machines that were in that facility in Demopolis suddenly show up in a bingo parlor in Jefferson County.
Wow.
I mean, so they steal out of a locked facility to bring those machines to another illegal operation in another city. And again, it shows me there's a network, and I think there is a network. And somehow or another too, and look, one of the things I think API has done a great job in is elevating the debate about the harm that's taking place. Particularly what you've written around young men, and the research every day is validating that, right?
Absolutely.
Particularly with the
digital betting, the sports betting, especially
these devices that we can have.
Speaking
in our
of March
hand all the
Madness.
time. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't imagine what those numbers look like.
Right.
But when we've been able to identify places we've closed with drug trafficking rings that want to launder money through ATM machines in there, and then when we interviewed this guy that went to federal prison for drug trafficking, was out of North Alabama and was connected to a facility in Jefferson County. And we're like, so why are you doing this? And he said, well, I can make the same amount of money selling drugs and potentially go to North Dakota to a federal prison.
Right.
Or at worst can face a misdemeanor in Alabama.
Yeah. If it's the same money, why would you take the risk?
Yeah, I mean, it's a business decision for him, right? I mean, it's just, and when you hear that, you're like, yeah, I get it. And it's why when folks talk about, we got to regulate the industry, that's why we got to do this. Well, easy thing to do.
Hit the enforcement.
Elevate those penalties and law enforcement do their job.
Yes, absolutely.
And I think it's probably the one area in which I've had the most disappointment with some of my law enforcement friends. And it's not many. Let's make it clear that this is not something that is engaged in a way that I think even the narrative's out there. But there are some that are just looking the other way.
Right.
And they talk about, well, we need to use discretion with regard to this. It's interesting. One of the ways that New York City during Rudy Giuliani's time as mayor was able to flip the script on public safety was it's called the broken windows theory, which said we're not going to ignore the little stuff. And so to somehow or another go, well, this is small potatoes. We're not going to do it. I think it just allows for people to be emboldened to do more and more. And I fully embrace the idea that you can eliminate the big stuff by dealing with the little stuff first. But the fact that if in fact we pick and choose the laws that we enforce and we don't, it doesn't make us in the executive branch enforces law that we're supposed to be. It makes us individual kings and queens, right? Because that means we get to decide what we think the law is and should be, not what has been the declared policy of our Constitution,
Right.
which is a constitutional provision, as well as other provisions in our law. And so, look, I'm going to be curious whether or not we see any more efforts this legislative session. Sadly, I think you see this. Maybe the efforts to be able to keep gambling away from us historically have been more because the gambling people can't agree than some of the opposition.
We call it greedlock.
That's a great phrase. But look, API has been leading the charge in the policy discussion as well as just the coordination of forces. God bless Greg Davis, right? And it's important that those voices are heard because people want to push it aside. And what the argument that I guess that bothers me the most is we're losing out on all this money.
I know.
We just we just want those resources. I don't think that's the decision point and the inflection point.
Right.
And it ought to be what's appropriate for the people of Alabama.
Right.
I mean,
what's good for the people.
We have not legalized cocaine, methamphetamine, fentanyl, right? I mean, we haven't said let's reschedule these drugs because there's a black market for it and we're making all this money.
It's happening, so let's legalize it.
And so that to me is it's a weak argument that tries to somehow or another make it appear as if Alabama's the victim for being principled and saying we don't want it.
Right. And I will note, and I'll note this and not ask you to opine on it, but I will note that there is a piece of legislation that was actually pre-filed by Matthew Hammett to increase those fines and enforcement on the lawlessness of the illegal gambling, and it has not moved even into committee.
Wow.
So it shows you where the priorities are. There may be another comprehensive bill that we receive after spring break. We'll see. But to me, the frustration is multifold, like yours, in that it seems predatory in nature by where they're operating. That's not an Alabama problem. That's a nationwide problem, that it's predatory in nature as far as the demographics that are being targeted. And then the question on resources, is a frustrating one for me. Running API, we're fiscal conservatives and social conservatives, and we have a $1.2 billion surplus currently. So the argument for needing resources off the backs of the poor is really hollow for us. So, and then your question about, or your statement about kind of the lawlessness or we're supposed to be a nation of laws, not of men. And that goes for our state too. And so I think that's one of those things that, we see on the national level that also filters down to the state level.
Yeah. So we'll keep the fight up.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, lastly, I just wanted to ask you, I don't know that you could probably narrow it down to what your most important thing that you've done since you were AG is, because like I said, I've kind of lost count of all the things that you've accomplished. But so I won't make you answer that question, but I do want to know, if you were not term limited, would you run for reelection? Is this something that you have enjoyed, or you feel like you've accomplished what you can?
First of all, I've absolutely enjoyed it. It's been remarkable. And look, I'll use a baseball analogy. I'm in extra innings, right? Because I've already had 8 years. Yeah,
absolutely you have.
And there's 2 more. I believe in term limits.
Yeah.
And despite the fact that I hope people have appreciated what we've done and have respected the role that I've played and feel like they've got what they voted for. I think there's points where you stay too long. And it's interesting, around the country, there are more AGs that are not term limited than there are. And I don't think the role of AG is designed to be a lifelong profession. And
that stagnation sets in.
And I think new ideas and new energy is good.
Right.
How Judge Pryor was AG was different than how Luther and how I've done it. And everyone has their own strengths and weaknesses.
Sure.
And I think what's one of the interesting things about the upcoming debate, and I will be a very interested observer on the AG front, is to hear what the vision is cast for the job. And to the extent that I think I have all the answers, then that makes me a little different than I think I am, which is I don't. But yeah, look, I'll miss the role.
Yeah.
Because it's been very much a remarkable blessing. And I think what I'll miss the most is the day-to-day interaction on the law enforcement side.
Mm.
Because if I look back at my career since 2001, those have been my people.
Yeah.
And it's who I feel the closest to. And when I'm not in either the role of that prosecutor or the role of AG,
Mm-hmm.
I'm not as relevant within that community as far as the day-to-day of what's going on. I mean, I've got relationships that'll be there for life.
Right.
But I think that's the part that I'll miss most. But no, I think we have term limits for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
I think 2 4-year terms is about right.
Mm-hmm.
Because the other thing I would tell you is I was a much better AG 2 years into the role than when I started.
Sure.
And it's just because you mature and understand
You figure
more.
it out.
You do. And I'm still, look, I think hopefully we call it practicing law for a reason because you're better at it over time. And I do
Right.
think I'm better today than I was in February 2017 when I came on board.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that by giving me 10 years is an exceedingly appropriate period, and excited that I think we'll see some good leadership coming forward.
Right. And many people were encouraging you to run for governor and shift into that role. You've publicly said that that's not the
Yeah,
role
just
that you
wasn't
think
me.
that God has for you. And I know that there are people encouraging you to run for a Senate seat if that opening occurs. If neither one of those things happen and you're not officially in public service, do you have a alternate plan that you and Tammy have talked about?
Buc-ee's
Buc-ee's.
is no. We're
They do have
Tammy,
a very high hourly wage, according to my sons.
Look, I've seen the signs outside as somebody travels the state. Haven't drifted that far
Yeah.
because I don't want to be distracted. But yeah, the governor thing just didn't make sense, and
Yeah.
we said that back, I guess, in November that just didn't want to go there. My identity is not defined by the position; it's defined by my relationship with Christ, and that's
Amen.
always going to be the focal point for me. And also, I think anybody that just wants to hold a position, I always get the question, what's next? As
Right.
if you have to run for office again.
Right.
And that was never the way I felt. Look, I have an interest in the Senate. If Coach Tubble decides to change, I think he's done an amazing job there.
I
And if he
agree.
stays there, I will 100% support him. If he moves, we'll look at it.
Mm-hmm.
But otherwise, Tammy said that Lee County looks like it may be in our future. She's a good Auburn
I
girl.
hear that.
And then we'll see what's next. I mean, I'm 60 years old. I'm not done with life. There's lots of stuff that I
There are
care
plenty of
about an
roles
awful
that you
lot.
could fill.
So we'll
Absolutely.
see. But
And I don't
wanna
even
be
mean in
obedient.
public service.
Yeah,
There-
no.
As someone who works in parallel to people who are elected officials, there's a lot of work to be done without having the title next to your name, and sometimes that background work and that preliminary work is as or more important than the vote that's cast or the work that's done.
Maybe some of the stuff I've enjoyed the most is the fact I get to work with Alliance Defending Freedom.
Yes.
I get to work with Heritage. I get to work with First Liberty. I get to work with API. I mean, there are people that it's why I have young people that say, I'm really interested in public service. What job should I run for? And I want to say it's not just about
Absolutely.
being in the political position. In fact, you may be able to create change in ways that you care about outside the political process.
Absolutely.
And it's why what this organization does and others do in developing a blueprint, which is not an easy thing to put together, and establish policy that you think is appropriate for our state, and then hold people like me accountable for the implementation of that, right? I think that is extremely valuable. And if, in fact, public service is no longer for me in the political world, that's probably something that is an area of interest for me down the road.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for your public
Hey, this
service,
was
and you need
fast.
to
No,
finish
thank
well.
you. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Alabama Policy Insights, and thank you to Attorney General Steve Marshall for being with us today.
Thank you.
Appreciate it so much.